So what was it? So all this context is very, very helpful. I came from the secular world, and wokeness doesn't even really have a name. It's just how the world works in that. And so coming into the faith and finding it in the faith, it's like, oh, wow. And so you kind of marinated in it in seminary, it sounds like, and you had the courage to speak up like, hey, this is unbiblical. It's anti-biblical. Maybe even heretical in some cases. Is that kind of some of the things that you were experiencing? Like, what stands out from your time in seminary that you were like, that's really bad?
Well, in 2014, when I first started attending Southeastern, I noticed that there was a lot of chapel speakers who came and either didn't focus on the Bible, or if they did, it was pretty weak. And it surprised me because I thought, this was a school that was big on expository preaching, and oftentimes not even being affiliated directly with the Southern Baptists, which I also thought was odd, but they would be talking about racial justice. I think that was the first thing to get its foot in the door. It wasn't the homosexual stuff or the feminist stuff as much, although now looking back, I realize there was a default kind of complementarian, weak complementarian idea there. But what we think of as associated with the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter and the modern LGBT stuff, that wasn't really present. Well, I should say that wasn't present with the exception of some of the BLM narrative. And I remember I wrote a blog later on about my experience in 2014 hearing some of these things, and I think I just called it the gospel of racial reconciliation because that was the term they often used. But I realized that what they were doing was they were ascribing all this guilt to people who weren't really guilty, and then saying the way to rectify this, and even using the term gospel to headline what this rectification would look like. But the way to rectify it was to diversify your churches and your theological books that you read and the speakers you listen to and the leadership. And in doing so, you would be fulfilling not only what Revelation says about every tribe, tongue, and nation around the throne of God, but you would be fulfilling the reconciliation that Jews and Gentiles are to have in Christ. And it just struck me that was so wrong. That was just, it just hit me. I knew at the time hearing that kind of stuff that was just wrong. No one had to really tell me. But it wasn't a huge deal because it was mostly in chapel. It wasn't in my classes that I was taking at that time as much. And I ended up, my seminary story is a little bit non-traditional. I ended up leaving seminary. I got married. I came back in 2017. When I came back, it was like everything had changed for the worse. I remember in the fall of 2017, there were 3 statements that either originated at or were heavily supported by the faculty and administration at the seminary that were denouncing Donald Trump or the alt-right. Goodness. The thing that bothered me was that I couldn't locate in the previous 8 years of Obama one statement that they had been as enthusiastic about. And I remember the whole Paige Patterson thing. That was not too long after that, where you might not know what this is, and it's a little too complicated to probably get into all the details. But they Me Too'd basically a conservative guy in the convention, and they set up a safe space thing at the school. I remember these pamphlets for safe spaces, and I saw the Me Too stuff now getting in, and there started to be a heavier concentration on abuse. So not only was there I would say a heavy CRT adjacent focus. And I could get into some details on that if you want. There's a lot of examples to pull from.
Please.
But there was also a Me Too stuff coming in, and a hint of some of the soft peddling of or I should say homosexual orientation and that kind of stuff. So the train was starting to make its way in, and I didn't see anyone. I'll just say this one thing. I talked to a few professors, and I couldn't really get anywhere with anyone completely. But the one professor who was actually sympathetic to, and he saw what was going on, I remember he wanted me to close the door, and he kind of whispered at me. It was kind of like the Gestapo might hear us or something, or the Stasi. Yeah. And he was just kind of like, what's going on is a travesty. Like, he was so against what was happening, but he's like, if I say anything, I'm going to lose my job. And this is a guy who had been there forever.
Wow.
And it shocked me. And he was basically like, keep your head down, don't say anything. That was his advice. And that was very hard for me.
Pretty terrible advice.
Like, this is wrong. But I tried to follow that to some extent. When I left, though, I'm not a student anymore. And I thought, well, if no one's going to say anything, if the faculty is not going to say anything, and I know about faculty members who tried to do something kind of, but no one was willing to go to public opinion or to talk to the people actually funding the school, who are the Southern Baptist Convention members. No one was willing to inform them about what was happening at their institution. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to do it. And that went viral, and that also got me a lot of hate. I even remember not long after I came out and started talking about what was happening, I remember a death threat. And I remember thinking, I'd never gotten one. So I remember, like, it was in my inbox, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, so do you call the police? Like, what do you do? Someone's saying he's going to kill me. But I didn't know who it was. It was anonymous. And now I'm realizing that's not a very uncommon occurrence with public figures. Right. But at the time, I wasn't a public figure. So I thought,
right,
what do you do with this? So, and that was in the Christian community. I can't imagine, like, who's saying this? Someone who's very concerned about Christian institutions. Really weird. Yeah, so that was kind of my thinking. Someone needed to say something. No one was doing it, so I'll do it.
Well, I'm glad you did, because more needs to be said. Of course, I'm reading Meg Basham's book right now, and it just seems like a very long, slow slide. And I wish I could say that, the way that you describe it and Shepherds for Sale describes it, I wish I could say that it sounds like a slow frog boil, but it kind of doesn't. In some ways, it sounds like it just kind of started happening overnight, and everyone just kind of just went along with it. Like, okay, well, this sounds about right. And that's the part that doesn't make any sense. I mean, I guess in some sense it does, right? Because people don't like to pop their heads up, and that's not uncommon. But it just seems like it was just pushed on everyone all at once. And everyone's like, well, okay, I guess it sounds like the gospel. I mean, was that kind of your experience? Because I had to deprogram myself of stuff that I had been marinating in for years. But instead, it sounds like in the Christian world, it just kind of all landed quite quickly somewhere in the 2010s.
Yeah, then that's a complicated question. I've thought about this a lot. And
cool.
I think you are onto something when you say it happened immediately. I think for a lot of people, they felt they were hit by a truck. And 2020 was the year that they felt that way. Of course, for me, it happened years before that in seminary. But when it finally filtered down into the promotional pamphlets and policies of various organizations like Cru or Samaritan's Purse or World Vision or these big Christian organizations, I think that's when people finally realized there's a problem. What they're saying sounds exactly like what the Democrat Party's saying. Mm-hmm. But this had been going on behind the scenes before that, and that's important to point out. It was a more gradual thing, I think, in the halls of power than it was with the populations that actually funded these halls of power. So there's a populism that reacted against this, and we're seeing that in places like Megan Basham's audience, I would say. Like, it's composed of a lot of people on even X, if you're following that. When Megan Basham has someone oppose her, she ratios them something bad. The people are with her. Well, that's not something that was present at all in 2019, 2020, 2021 even, really. And some of that could have been Twitter controls and all of that. But I know of a bunch of people that I can think of off the top of my head who at that point were buying into some of the woke garbage, and now they've rejected it. And so I think the train had to hit them. It had to get personal, possibly. It had to affect their local church. Those are the people that I see as most ardently against it, are the ones where it affected their business or their church directly, and they saw it rip everything apart, like a tornado coming through. But yes, it is important to know that this was going on in the background for a long time. And one of the things I write about in Social Justice Goes to Church, actually, I didn't realize I have a copy of that right here. I write about it in this book, is that in the 70s, there were a lot of people who thought, well, observers, I should say, who paid attention to these kinds of things, who thought evangelicals would wind up on the left. If you remember, Jimmy Carter was promoted as an evangelical. There was a document called the Chicago Declaration in 1973, and it was a social justice declaration. You can look at it. It sounds like it was written in 2020. There was, before Jimmy Carter, there was an Evangelicals for McGovern group. And it seemed like the evangelicals could be open to Democrat Party politics. But it wasn't a broad thing. It wasn't like the evangelicals were lining up for this. It was more academic types and people who would later become, like the founders of organizations and people teaching at schools, more elite types that were attracted to the leftism. And one of the things that I try to point out, and maybe you could even say it's the thesis of the book in some way, is that these figures, and I'm talking about people like Ron Sider, people like Jim Wallace, Tim Keller. I have a whole section on Tim Keller. Mm-hmm. People like Richard Mao. I mean, there's a lot of figures I talk about. These guys ended up gaining influence kind of behind the scenes. And as the religious right, which was a populist movement, gained traction in the 80s, these guys didn't go away. They were still in the backgrounds. They were still, and they had people who followed them who were gaining positions in influential places. Russell Fuller will tell you, who's a former Hebrew professor at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, that there were a lot of liberals that he even worked with and knew were liberal. Like they did not have orthodox theology that ended up at conservative places because they needed a job. And so the Southern Baptists like to talk about how they purged in the 80s and early 90s, they purged themselves of liberals at these schools. But Russell Fuller will tell you that's not entirely accurate, that a lot of these people ended up staying, and they ended up, people who were influenced by that first crop of social justice activists and evangelicalism, they ended up gaining more influence. And so I know that's a long way of saying it, but I think what happened in the 2010s is with organizations like the Gospel Coalition and others, we like to use them as like the focal point, but Christianity Today, I would say, had been on this train even before that. They ended up with these popular leaders who used mass media, who used the internet to get their message out. But these guys had already been somewhat influenced. And I'm talking about guys like David Platt. I talk about him in that book. There's a picture of David Platt and Russell Moore, and Ron Sider is in between them. And they both, and then it's on Instagram. And I don't remember who posted it, but it says that, one of our heroes influences, these guys that were basically socialists ended up impacting the people who became popular preachers to popular audiences in 2010. So it escaped the lap. It got out of the more elite circles and it got into the popular circles in the 2010s. It started mostly in the seminaries. And then in 2020, that's when it really jumped to filter down to the congregational level. And I knew that would happen. That's one of the things, I probably said it in 2019 in January when I made my first video, that we are gonna see in the next few years, as the graduates from these institutions make their way into churches, they will split them up. That is exactly what's happened. They have gone into these churches and they have split them up, and it's terrible to see what's happened.